Hello everyone, welcome to the first YouTube session of the Pixel Project's 7th International Women's Day edition of our Read for Pixels campaign. My name is Anusha Kandasivam, I'm your moderator for this session. Through Read for Pixels, the Pixel Project is collaborating with 12 award-winning and best-selling women writers to raise awareness about violence against women and to raise funds for the Pixel Project to keep our efforts to end violence against women alive and kicking. Now, I'll be telling you more about the Read for Pixels fundraiser a little later. We have lots and lots of exclusive author goodies, but meanwhile, if you want to find out about the Pixel Project, about the work we do, please do go to www.thepixelproject.net. Okay, so let me tell you about today's session. We have a very special guest for the live Read for Pixels discussion and Q&A session, the amazing award-winning author Alaya Dawn Johnson. Alaya is a Nebula Award-winning short story writer and the author of 7 novels for adults and young adults. Her most recent adult novel, Trouble the Saints, is out from Tor Books, and her debut YA novel, The Summer Prince, was longlisted for the National Book Award for Young People's Literature. And the follow-up, Love is a Drug, was awarded the Andre Norton Award. She has numerous short stories that have appeared in many magazines and anthologies, including Asimov's FNSF and A Phoenix First Must Burn. And she lives in Oaxaca, Mexico. I hope I pronounced that correctly. So Alaya has generously donated some really awesome goodies to the stash of author goodies we have set up as perks for donors at the Read for Pixels Rally Up fundraising page. So there are 2 sort of bundles. So goodie number 1 is Alaya Dawn Johnson writes you a poem or a piece of flash fiction. So she is offering to write one very generous donor either a poem or a piece of flash fiction based on a word of your choice. So over the years, Alaya's short stories and poems have won much acclaim, and now you can have one especially written by her for you and only you. She will email you one soft copy of the story or poem, and then a signed copy of the story or poem that has been scanned into a PDF file. So that's goodie number 1. Goodie number 2 is Alaya will critique 7,000 words of your work in progress. So the donor who donates to get this critique session will have one written critique of a portion of your work in progress by Alaya, which is up to 7,000 words of your work. One round of up to 5 follow-up questions in one email with Alaya after she has sent you her critique. So if you are a fantasy author, you're just starting out, especially, here's your golden opportunity to get some honest and professional feedback on your work. And both of these treats are available to donors worldwide. Now remember, all funds go towards the Pixel Project's work to help end violence against women, so please do give generously before the fundraiser ends on the 15th of April. We have already raised $335, so we have some ways to go to our $5,000 goal. And I will be telling you exactly how you can get your hands on all this amazing stuff a little later and how you can help the cause and donate, so stay tuned for that. We'll be sharing some links. And yeah, oh, one more thing. Before we start the reading and Q&A, you, the audience, can participate. You may ask questions, but just make sure you're logged into your YouTube account, and you can type your questions into the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. And our producers, Shashin and Denisha, will relay the questions to me and Alaya to answer. Okay, so let's put Alaya on screen. Hi, Alaya. How are you doing?
Thank you so much. Hi, Anusha. Thanks so much
for being here. So, yeah, so let's get into it. Tell us what you're reading, and I'll just put you on screen, and just go for it.
Okay, awesome. So I'm going to read an excerpt, like the first bit of a short story. It's actually a piece of narrative nonfiction, so it's kind of a little autobiographical. That it's the first piece of narrative nonfiction that I've published. Honestly, and it came out last year in the amazing anthology Come On In, which was out from Inkyard Press last year, edited by Adi El Said, and it's an amazing anthology of short stories all about immigration. And I live in, as Anisha said, in Oaxaca, Mexico, and I immigrated to Mexico 7 years ago. So this is kind of a little bit about like kind of what informed that experience. And so I am just going to read like 10 minutes from the first bit of that story.
Yeah, awesome.
So it's called Volviéndome. It's different every time I go back. The very familiarity makes it strange to me, as though I have fallen asleep to travel the old corridors of my half-forgotten childhood, where my friends and family and I slide into our grooves, side-by-side troughs in the sediment of the last 30 years, so deep that we can hardly see one another. But I am not asleep as I land in National. We old Washingtonians who remember our loyalty still refuse to use that bastard's name. I am awake, and my skin feels inside out, rasping like a hair shirt as I step onto the gate bridge. The air is thick and sweet, the sun weak. I am stepping across a chasm into another time, another life. I was born in DC, and I spent my 20s in New York, but 5 years ago, I packed 2 suitcases and fled across the border. I remade myself. I learned Spanish, found kindred spirits among my fellow displaced diasporic artists of Mexico City, entered a master's program to sit with ancient texts in old languages and dream of the past. I liked so much of the person I was becoming that I began to flinch from the girl I had been. Her places were not my own. And yet I have landed. I try not to think about what I have come here to do. It's an old trick. Some decisions, however necessary, must be left to the edges of your thoughts until you have already jumped. Then they can be grieved. I think of Mexico instead. Evening downpours, the morning trash bell, atole and tamales for breakfast, the old sun, the burning eye. But everyone else wants to get off the plane. My past pushes me forward. It's different every time I go back, but this feeling of being 2 in 1, a snake required at regular intervals to slide back into a dry and raspy skin, this is the same. It is a kind of home. I was 19 years old, about to go on my 3rd date with an older man. He had convinced me to give him my email address at a political rally that I was covering for my university newspaper. He had said, "Do you want to have your most interesting interview of the night?" I was feeling both overwhelmed and beautiful. He was too old for me, 36, but I told myself I didn't care. At least he was interesting. He had a kind of totalizing presence that comforted me with its familiarity, even though I half-heartedly bit back. The grooves were already there. His genius had just been to find them and make himself at home. We went to the restaurants that he wanted, listened to the 70s bands that he liked, and he lectured me on the big-name leaders of the U.S. political left that had been neglected in my Washington, D.C. private school education. Noam Chomsky, Alexander Cockburn, Eric Foner, Howard Zinn. A bunch of white men, but when I called him on it, he said, reprovingly, that no white man was more anti-racist than he was. Didn't he love black women? That afternoon, before the older man picked me up from in front of my dorm, my mother called me. "I just wanted you to know that your father has decided to leave the religion." "What do you mean leave? As in he no longer believes in our religion?" "He's had a series of revelations, and he's decided that while it has many good elements, it isn't the true path." "So he just what? Raised us to believe in this not true path for the last 19 years, and now he's like, whoops, my mistake? Was he planning to tell me this?" "I'm sure your father wants to talk to you about his next steps. He is using his spiritual tools to create a new path." "He's starting his own religion?" "It isn't a religion. It's a spiritual path to higher consciousness." I must have said something. I must have said goodbye. The words of my childhood had softened, and then rotted in my mouth. I had been struggling with my faith for the last year. I had left the holy book on my shelf where it seemed to glow with a toxic shame of my inadequacy, of my obstinate need to judge its contents and find them not just unbelievable, but offensive. Dad had told me that I was just too spiritually underdeveloped, that the brilliance of the text would make itself clear to me as I surrendered myself to God and our spiritual leader. The God and spiritual leader that he had apparently decided were a big lie about 2 weeks ago. Only now had my mother bothered to tell me. Dad had been the highest ranking spiritual aide in the region when we were growing up. He would wake us up at 5 a.m. every weekday for prayer services before school. He would criticize our spiritual development, our inability to fully practice the doctrine. I told the older man on our date. I made it a joke. Can you believe that my mom called to just casually inform me that my dad left his cult, the one he raised us in, to found his own? So I guess I've lost my religion? He told me that he was agnostic. I liked the sound of that. I didn't want to hear another word about my spiritual goddamn development for the rest of my life. I decided it that very night. We went to some East Village concert in some bar where they ought to have ID'd me, but the older man convinced the bouncer I had left mine behind. He was charming, practiced, persuasive in his conviction to get whatever he wanted. It was a familiar dynamic, but more pleasant. What he wanted was to show me his world. As long as it was nothing like my own, I would take it, hold it until my hands bled and I forgot why I clung so tightly in the first place. I only knew that I had to hold on or I would have to face myself, a kind of death. I went to Mexico for the first time a few months before I finally broke things off with the older man. After 8 years, the pressure of his presence, once so comforting in its familiarity, weighted down my very organs. I felt as though I were face down on a glue trap. If I stayed, I knew where I would end, the self-hypnotizing handmaiden to a demagogue. Agnostic white savior or Latter-day Black Messiah did not make as much of a difference to the fundamental dynamic as I had imagined at 19. I went to Mexico with my sister and I began to breathe again. We spent our days climbing ruins. We climbed the baths of Nezahualcóyotl, the poet king of Texcoco, who would take to the waters in the rocky hills above his mist-shrouded city and contemplate the death of all his glory. Not forever in this earth, only here for a little while. Even jade shatters, even gold cracks, even quetzal plumes fall to pieces. Not forever on this earth, only here for a little while. A little stone frog squatted on the edge of one bathing pool, a worn-down stump where his face used to be. We climbed over the terraced hillside, the earth fragile and crumbly with the ash of a recent slash and burn. I imagined these baths the way they would have looked in Nezahualcóyotl, volcanic stone whitewashed and decorated green and blue, running with clear waters that would have reflected the 1,000 colors of the day and night. I imagined the farmland surrounding them, the terraced maize fields, much like the ones we hiked through in our tourist sandals. The maize would push up from the lunar black and gray, green stalks covered with a fine down, diamond-studded in the morning fog and green as jade when the sun blinks its eye. The rains would end, and ears, golden, sapphire, and onyx, would be struck from stalks, hung in garlands in storerooms and local temples. And those selfsame stalks, old and brown now, would fall to the earth in a great burning to be reborn, like Quetzalcoatl with the morning star. I did not know any of that then. I was busy dying, as it turned out, in preparation. We would drag our dusty feet back into the city that night, eat the cheapest food we could find in La Condesa, not very cheap, and collapse in our hostel bed. Every night I was assailed by terrors. I could barely feel my body. I could barely think. I dreamed of rat mazes, endless turns and dead ends, and no possible escape until I awoke, heart pounding. And yet I was cradled in the unknown speech of this place, the languages that I did not know and whose very mystery cleared my throat of words I no longer believed. Among the old bones of civilizations lost to the earth, that old skin of an ancient crocodile, the hard knot in the wet rag of what had been my heart eased just a little. I thought to myself, a voice from the other end of the wormhole, my own self screaming back in time, a signal flare. I could live here. All right, thank you. It's a little bit of my story.
It's pretty amazing. I love how descriptive it is, and it's, I guess, a very familiar feeling for a lot of people. Like this sensation of being overwhelmed by your life and just wanting rebirth. That,
Yes.
yeah, pretty cool. And of course that description of that older man, kind of creepily preying on you, even though you don't realize it at the time. I think a lot of young women go through that as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and at least she did realize it, you know. Anyway, okay, let's go on. I mean, she sounds like a pretty amazing person, this character in your short story. And we're going to talk about some other amazing women that you have written. But before I go into the first question, I just want to remind everybody that they can also ask Alaya questions. Just type it into the chat box, and then we will ask Alaya the question. So here we go. We'll start with one of mine. So your book feature plenty of fantastic female characters and protagonists like June Costa, Phyllis, Emily Bird. They're all complex characters with agency, but they're also very human and they have their flaws. First question is, what or who are your inspirations for your female characters?
I mean, each character kind of has her own genesis in me. I will say I'm very interested. Like I really feel like kind of like my overall arching kind of goal as a writer, or like one of like my key interests is definitely kind of exploring how women and girls like navigate the world. And so I do spend a lot of time writing female characters. Like it's almost kind of like a real challenge for me to kind of get out of that mode. But in terms of my inspiration for them, a lot of them, frankly, they all have like kind of strong elements of myself. It's kind of one of those things where I'll kind of take like a certain aspect of my personality or a certain aspect of my upbringing or something, and like a kind of like more autobiographical detail, and I'll kind of maybe put more emphasis on it than is actually like in my own personality, and like the process of that like ends up kind of creating this other character. Because of course they're going through situations that are totally different from ones that I've actually gone through, even though they have elements in common with me. So that's a lot of it. Some of it's also just, I mean, I grew up reading amazing novels by women writers, and I just loved the characters that they created, and so it was just very natural to me to want to like continue that tradition. So I grew up reading Tamora Pierce and Diana Wynne Jones and Octavia Butler, and I just like. I mean, as far as I was concerned, like that was what I wanted to do. I mean, I was not playing around with anything. Oh, I mean, even like the first novel that I read, this is truly bizarre, but I mean, the first novel that I decided to read was The Secret Garden, and I was 5 years old, and I understood no words of The Secret Garden, so it was a kind of a funny thing to try to do. I just kept reading it over and over again until like 3 years later, I kind of understood the whole book. But like Mary Lennox is, and that novel has all sorts of issues, obviously. I would not recommend it to anybody like, unwarned, but it's it has at its heart, it's a really beautiful story, and I love that kind of like growth of Mary Lennox as a character, and I think that was some maybe really reaching back. Like that's kind of one of those things I always love to be able to show in my novels, especially is that kind of like deep character growth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So a lot of all genres have their share of female stereotypes and tropes, right? And you write what could be considered sort of speculative fantasy, alternative histories, or potential futures, which you could easily fall back on much worn tropes. And most of your characters are also women of color, people of color. So Phyllis, for example, is a Black female protagonist, which is something very rare in science fiction and fantasy. Could you tell us how do you break stereotypes and subvert tropes to create a POC female character with agency who deals with the world around her, including sexism, misogyny, violence against women and girls, and especially characters who don't fit into culturally prescribed gendered norms, including appearance and behavior?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I write characters that have to deal with all that. It's because it's like, we all have to deal with all that, right? So like, how does every person like try to find a place for themselves, like feel comfortable with themselves, as a person, also figure out a place for themselves in society. I mean, and those things, are so many intersections of that. I mean, you mentioned Phyllis, and that's in Trouble with Saints, and she's just, par excellence, like that kind of a character where she's very deliberately situated herself kind of outside of the mainstream of her culture. She is a Black woman who's passing as white in certain contexts, over and beyond like the fact that she's also a hit woman for the mob. I mean, I feel that really when it comes down to figuring out who she was as a character, I mean, the fact that she was passing was like the very first step. It's a kind of violence that she chose to enact in order to survive, right? And I think those are the kinds of questions that I am always, I just find myself like kind of like my magnet as a writer, like kind of keeps going back to them. So, I mean, I don't know if I Yeah, I don't know if I'm trying to like subvert tropes in a kind of conscious way. Let me put it like that. I think
Okay.
I'm trying to write characters that feel worthy of all of the incredible complexities of the life I live, and my parents and my grandparents and my friends and like everyone in my community. Like I'm trying to observe the world, or like make sense of my experience in it. And so that just means that I obviously consume all sorts of media and literature, and a lot, as you say, I mean, there's just not a lot of POC women characters. There's certainly not a lot of Black women main characters in speculative fiction, even now. And we are truly living through a renaissance of Black speculative literature. Um, Even so, it's a small minority. And and I guess, some of it certainly is, I'm inspired totally by like my colleagues and the amazing work that they're putting out right now. But it's also just that I always wanted to write these stories. I mean, I almost feel like, I should say, oh, I want to read these stories, but I mean, I did, but I think like when it comes down to it, I just always wanted to write them. I mean, maybe like that first spark was just because there's just nothing. I mean, when I was 13 and 14, there was just nothing. Aside from Octavia Butler, again, she was brilliant and wonderful and just revolutionary for me. But that's one writer, and I was just reading like these and she also mostly wrote pretty deep science fiction, and I later in my life like came to love science fiction. But when I was 12, 13, 14, I was like a giant thick fantasy nerd, and there just was nothing in the giant thick fantasy nerd section, the bookstore. There obviously were, even at the time, like George Saunders wrote like big fantasy novels, but of course George Saunders was not in the Barnes and Noble. So there was like that kind of like constant marginalization made it so that I was like constantly consuming certain kinds of literature that had just been stripped of any of these other realities. So to me, like growing up as a writer, I just like desperately wanted to write that. I like had to figure out a way to write that. And so that's kind of what is animating me. And so the tropes are like, I mean, what is there? It's just like, well, we die or something, I mean, it's just like, that's just useless. Like I want to pay attention to that. So I mean, it's not, I mean, I would never say I'm like inventing this out of whole cloth or anything, but I would say like when I was younger and I hadn't read as widely, I did feel as if I was just kind of like pushing myself into a wilderness, just like, how do I write this thing that I want to write, and that kind of came with it, this, I guess, subverting tropes, just because there was just a lot that was not either useful, actively harmful, or like not there, and so in that kind of a void, you have to try to figure out what you can contribute and like how you can kind of make it work for the sort of thing that's in your head.
Yeah, I see what you mean. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so let's keep speaking about your speculative fiction. So in The Summer Prince, there's this amazing, incredible city, the mega city of Palmares Tres. It's a female-led society, and the highest positions of powers are held by women. But it's not the stereotypical, all-welcoming, loving female-centric society that one might expect. Life is difficult, even violent sometimes. There are clear class divides, and people have to fight and work hard to survive. Why did you create or shape this world of Palmares Tres around this type of hierarchical matriarchy instead of a more egalitarian one that, let's say, some people might expect?
Yeah, that's I love this question. So, okay, why is Palmeiras Tres not like the utopia we wish it were? There is perhaps a certain kind of like fundamental pessimism inside of me as to humans and our ability to create genuinely egalitarian societies. I'm also constantly trying to like push against this in like kind of natural pessimism. Like I don't want to like sit on it. You know what I mean? But I would say like that novel is almost like kind of like a classic example of me like attempting to question myself about that kind of pessimism, but also trying to be, just kind of show the way that I've seen things. And I feel that Palma, like, the Summer Prince focuses almost entirely on a social movement, on a kind of deep dream of the young people in that novel to make their society be better than it is. So I feel that it's certainly easy to focus on that. But on the other hand, I also always try to tell people, like, listen, all the problems that Palmares has, it is like vastly better place to live than basically almost any other place on like planet Earth right now. Like, and I mean this with like full acknowledgement of its class issues, its colorism issues, its kind of, I would not call it exactly reverse sexism, but it certainly has gender issues. All of the other things that are going on, it's very much a place where there is a solid and strong like bottom floor to poverty. There's a very strong kind of like cultural bias against violence, against kind of structural violence and also interpersonal violence, like all sorts of these huge problems plaguing our world, today are at the very least significantly mitigated in that utopian city. And so what I wanted to write was what I always kind of like feel is this nod to Ursula Le Guin's brilliant works, like the Dispossessed and The Left Hand of Darkness, which are, well, I'll call them, right, like complicated utopias. They are not dystopias in any kind of like classical sense. It's not just a failed society created in order to show up the failures of our society or give us a warning for what our society can fall into. No, they're active societies that are attempts, are clear attempts to redress wrongs of the world we are currently living through, and they are a conversation with those problems and an attempt by those people to make those things better. And The Dispossessed actually is like really interesting on this front because it shows two kind of complicated utopias. And you wouldn't even think, like, from the perspective of the novel, I'm not trying to spoil too much here, but that the society of the, I forget the names of these planets, but like there's a moon kind of anarchist society, and then there's like the planetary kind of sybaritic, like physics society that the main character goes down to. And like, you would, from the perspective of the main character, that's just kind of a totally fallen society. But if you actually like look at it, or there's a wonderful conversation with the ambassador from Earth towards the end of the novel, or the ambassador from Earth is like, hey, I don't know if you've noticed, but this place is actually kind of a paradise, which really upends your thinking of it because it has so many social problems. And so that is kind of what I was going for, which is like that, how can we fix some of these things? What could a different society look like? What could things look like that are a little better than this? But without like losing sight of the fact that, humans are humans, and a lot of these issues cannot be solved with this kind of glib, if women were in charge, like, I don't think that's going to solve every problem at all, but I do think it might solve some problems. And so that was kind of what I was experimenting with in Palmares.
Yeah. And I guess the thing is that women are also people, right? So that you're going to have people who make mistakes and who have their own agendas and, things like that. So it's not going to be all wonderful and amazing and hugs all around.
No.
Yeah. Do you ever feel pressured by gender and cultural stereotypes, though, to make your female characters likable or relatable? Have you had any feedback on that?
I do. And yes. And
Okay.
that's an issue. I don't really know what to do about that. I'm always constantly kind of like shocked when that happens. Why am I shocked when this happens? I guess I feel like there's just a lot, like a really limited band in which, like, culturally speaking, in the West, in the US, like, people like seem to want to allow their female characters to play or exist. And this, I mean, it's so narrow. It's so much narrower than what culturally in general is allowed for a male character. And it's to me, it's just so, it's not just limiting. I mean, obviously it's limiting, but it's baffling because it's just like, how is this, correspond in any way to like emotional depth or reality, I guess. Like in what way does me needing this character just be likable, or people judge, readers intend to judge women characters much more harshly than they judge men characters. And I am absolutely guilty of this too. I mean, I remember, kind of really trying to break down sometimes in novels and like why I just hated this woman character, and I, and if I really like poke at it, sometimes it's just because I am trained you know, because we're all kind of swimming in the same toxic sexist stew, that like women characters should cater to me in some way, like should, you know, aren't allowed to be interesting because they're morally culpable or gray, or, you know, so Phyllis Green or Phyllis LeBlanc in Trouble with Saints is absolutely that kind of character. She's a character I wrote so explicitly to be as like deep and morally complex and dark, and I don't mean to say like I wanted to write just like a total, you know, like grim dark, you know, she's just like a killer and she, you know, I mean, that's not what she is at all, right? But she's absolutely not this kind of plucky heroine, like with goodness in her heart. And I mean, I've loved many a novel of that kind of character. It's not to diss that kind of story. It's to say that those stories tend to be kind of like the limit of what people will accept in a main character who's a woman or a girl. And unfortunately, even those characters often get raked over the coals for totally normal and psychologically understandable decisions. You know, like why is she, you know, being so mean to this boy? Kind of complaints. You know, and that's all over the place. And that's the kind of thing that I am trying to write against. You know, I mean, I obviously write a character like Phyllis. I'm saying like absolutely, here it is. This is my. I try to, you know, I love these novels by Dorothy Dunnett called The Lyman Chronicles. I'm like I'm always here to tell people how much I love The Lyman Chronicles. And one of the fabulous things that those novels have, they're like historical fiction novels about an extremely morally complex Scottish nobleman in the 15th century, and they're just bizarre and wonderful and strange and just like have influenced so many writers. I don't even understand. Like it's hard to even explain it, but one of the things that's like really characteristic of those novels is that main character, Lyman, Francis Crawford of Lyman, he just contains universes. He is deep, he is psychologically consistent, but he's very hard. There are moments when you truly hate him, and then you kind of love him again. And he's so deeply charismatic. And so and you follow 6 novels of this guy. I mean, fat novels. And it doesn't matter. I mean, like, even though he's like, they're told through all different people's points of view, they're all kind of following him and his story. And I just love that kind of loving attention paid to this incredibly deep, complex character. And that was something I wanted to be able to bring to a woman character, and especially a woman of color, especially a Black woman, you know? So that was what I wanted to do, and not feel constrained by this idea of her likability. Like Dorothy Dunnett was not concerned about Lyman being likable at all points in that novel. There was no reason for her to be concerned about it. And nobody reviewing those books is like, well, she's such an ass. Like, I mean, they might say it, but they're not saying it as a critique. Like, they're saying it as I was so frustrated and then it got so good, you know? And I think, you know, it's hard because as readers, as I said, we've all been kind of indoctrinated in this kind of idea of like these really narrow expectations of women. And so it's really hard to kind of confront our own internalized misogyny in that way, as a writer. So like, that's what I've been trying to do as a writer, and I'm still totally working on it, and also as a reader.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so another aspect of that is that the Bechdel test, where you know, women talk about things other than men. So your books definitely pass the Bechdel test, but a lot of especially science fiction, fantasy authors, they do still have trouble writing stories that pass the Bechdel test. Why do you think that is, and what do you have any suggestions for writers who want to write female conversations and relationships realistically?
I mean, if you're a woman writer, I guess like trying to think about, you know, I mean, I'd say this like not, I mean, I feel like whenever I say this, it's going to sound kind of facetious, but I'm not being facetious. I mean, I understand that this is actually kind of like weird to kind of get out of like what we have been trained to expect in storytelling. So kind of think outside of the box for a second of what stories that you have been exposed to do, as in like stop thinking about movies and television and books. Like in your life, what kind of conversations do you have with women in your life and girls in your life? Like that to me is like the foundation point, because if you think about that, it becomes perfectly obvious. You have all sorts of conversations, and like, sure, you can have like a long dishy conversation about guys every once in a while, but that's not, you know, I mean, even if you are going through a relationship crisis, that might maybe comprise 50% of your conversations. And I mean, that's like in a moment where you are truly talking about men all the time, right? I mean, under normal circumstances, if things are more or less okay, or if you're not having problems with men in your life, I mean, like that might be 10% of your conversations, 20. And I think like when you realize that, it's a sort of like, imagine that it's okay. Here's a great analogy. It's like looking at those drawings where you see a beautiful woman, and then they're like, look at it again, and you see an old man. It's just that you just realize like, oh, that's just the way that people show us. That's not actually like the way we are. I'd say it's a little harder to try to write that because again, like all the templates, for how fiction should go or how these stories should be told, like constantly have that as like, this is the scene where the two women dish about the man, right? And so like when you go against that, you really have to kind of like pull from certainly maybe more obscure sources. You have to maybe invent some things. You have to kind of temporize in a way that is not is not, you don't have to do that as much if you are going with like the kind of set template. So I mean, that's definitely like if you're looking to try to change that up, or at least kind of look at your work through another critical angle, it would be that. It would just be to say, just pause and say, like, if I were actually living through this, who would I talk to? Like, who would be on my, my WhatsApp chat group? Like, what kind of conversations would I be having about this? And if they're really different conversations from the ones that are actually in the book, then might be because you kind of naturally like gone through the kind of like well-traversed cultural rut, which is deeply misogynistic and really just not psychologically or emotionally realistic. It's just not the way that women tend to see and interact with the world, even, and this is the excuse that I often see in science fiction and fantasy, especially fantasy, because I feel like I have to say this because I've just come across this so much and it frustrates me so much. That because fantasy often is taking place in universes that are based on a known misogynistic, sexist society of medieval or Renaissance Europe. So that means that, of course, the women, they just can't have the same kind of agency. And it ends up being this kind of defense of, well, you can't have like a feminist in the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine or something. And this is just, I mean, I can't even get over like how much of a non sequitur this argument is. Like, it's just so absurd. Like, no one is like, he has to be like a dyed-in-the-wool, suffragette. I mean, that's not like what anyone's talking about. We're talking about like emotionally realistic depictions of women that actually take into account like our complex and varied lives. And I feel like the best refutation of that kind of ridiculous notion of how to depict women in medieval kind of societies, where, well, there was so like the men are just so powerful, like they just have to think about them all the time, is Nicola Griffith's Hild, which is maybe kind of very, very, very mildly fantastical, but it's very much like historical fiction. I'm not sure of the century now that I'm saying this out loud, but I think maybe like 11th century, but like do not quote me on that. But it's like medieval England, and it's really a brilliant novel. It's just so brilliant, and I just loved it so much for like the depth and care and interest that she constantly goes into showing this kind of very sex society in a lot of ways, and how women interact and have their own networks and speak to one another. There's just no reason why women wouldn't speak to one another about all sorts of things that aren't, this man. And I just wish so much that that writers would challenge themselves a little more to really think about that, especially women writers, because we just, even now, have so much of our own personal experiences that women maybe not putting to practice,
All right. That's a really good answer. I guess speaking of historical fiction, since we're there, we have an interesting question from one of the audience members. So let me just put it on the screen. Here, Misty306. Misty is a long-time watcher of all our sessions. Hi, Misty. Great to see you again. So she says, there have been numerous publications of Black Girl Magic and Black historical fiction books. What are your thoughts about your books and books by N.K. Jemisin, Afia Atakora, and Colson Whitehead, etc.?
Okay, awesome. I actually have not read books of Afi Atakora, so I could not speak to that. But N.K. Jemisin and Colson Whitehead, I've definitely read, and I am huge, huge fan. Yeah, I mean, like I said, we are living through an actual renaissance of um, of historical and speculative fiction by Black writers. I mean, it's honestly, I mean, wow, would I not have expected this when I was 13? Or like, if I had this was living through this when I was 13, I'd just be over the moon because it's so, so different. Um, and just so rich and so wonderful. And I can only imagine, with this kind of bounty to choose from, what young writers now, what 13-year-olds now dreaming of being writers are going to produce in 10 years. So this is just to me like astonishing and wonderful, and like I'm here for it. I think N.K. Jemisin is brilliant. She's absolutely brilliant. The Broken Earth trilogy is just like mind-boggling. Every time I think about those books, I think about one little world-building detail, which I think it came in the second book. I'm not 100% sure, but I think it's in the second book. It's kind of irrelevant. The detail is what I mean is like the depth of world building, like the kind of like range of thought. I mean, what I love about her work in particular is the extent to which she puts, totally, whatever kind of silly ideas people might have had, like, oh well, these writers of color, they're just going to write about their own cultures, or like they're just kind of like mired in like their own kind of, politics of identity or whatever. I mean, there's nobody could possibly refute this better than N.K. Jemisin. I mean, like those books are so sprawling and so wide ranging and so like deeply thoughtful and like filled with so much kind of just like robust thought about human society and how humans interact. Sure, its own voices in the sense that, she's a Black writer and that informs her view of the world. And that all that says to me is that, like, think of how much, wonderful, brilliant fiction we've been missing out on by the kind of constant, systematic and, like social exclusion of writers of color, like all these other writers who could have, been building on all of these other works, like this. Just so anyway, I feel like that's just it's just wonderful to see that happening. And Colson Whitehead, I think, is obviously brilliant. Nobody needs me to tell them. I think Colson Whitehead's brilliant, like won the Pulitzer twice now. But I particularly love The Intuitionist, which is not speculative fiction and yet is about sentient elevators and like feels so speculative to me. And I just loved it so much. I loved it so much.
Okay, that's really cool. Misty says, I like that term, the Black speculative fiction renaissance. I believe I found the next topic for my next article for the SFWA. That's awesome.
Awesome. Yes, do it.
Okay, so let's move on to the next questions. Now, we've been talking about women. Let's talk about men. So your books do feature some misogynistic characters, but in general, the male-female relationships between the main characters, they're generally quite equitable. And some of your male characters are, of course, respectful of women, of their thoughts and decisions. You mentioned in your recent AMA that you did that you realized and accepted that issues about gender, race, and class are the central questions of stories that you write. Do you think it's better to write about more utopian worlds where everyone thinks it's normal that all genders are equal and that female characters have power and they drive plots forward? Or do you think writers should include patriarchy, sexism in their worlds to reflect the real world?
Yeah, I feel like it depends on what the writers are interested in kind of highlighting, right? I mean, I have no notion of having a kind of like one size fits all writers for this. I've tended to, in my own work, err on the side of having, as you say, societies that are more egalitarian on the axis of gender. I tend to do that because I feel that in my own kind of sense of the world is more transformative to try to show this, to try to explore how this would actually look, than it is to reproduce the kinds of sexism that I've lived with all my life. And show someone fighting against that. That's not to say that those both aren't like very much, feminist, anti-misogynist takes. Like they definitely can be. It's just that I tend to want to positively render something that makes it, how men and women and non-binary people and, a society can organize itself where gender is not an axis of oppression. That to me has been hugely important. And I tend to also, with certain exceptions, try to also make societies where race and ethnicity is not an axis of oppression. Certainly there are differences marked. I'm not trying to, I don't tend to try to create societies where it's just like gender doesn't exist or race doesn't exist. I mean, they do, but it's that the idea, to me, it seems more transformative and maybe revolutionary to try to really imagine what it would look like if those things that are just so embedded in our understanding of the world are seen in a completely different way. So that kind of struggle is one that I am kind of constantly trying to deal with. I feel like if I want to figure out or deal with sexism in a more kind of overt way, I tend to write historical fiction. I try not to imagine it. I guess what I'm trying to say. It seems kind of exhausting to me to try to imagine like a whole new science fictional sexism. But like I said, that's just like my own personal choice.
Yeah. Okay. Well, following that thread, do you think that reframing how stories describe men away from hostile and toxic stereotypes and towards complexity, even vulnerability, can be one of the ways that science fiction fantasy writers can break away from all these toxic tropes that promote toxic masculinity and basically the dehumanization of women?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, to me, that's part of the reason why I feel like it's so revolutionary to do that, to just show something else, to just have men be present and real and emotionally vulnerable in a novel in a way that does not, as far as I am able to. Obviously, I am still a product of the society, and my own biases are to some extent still, not going to be clear to me. To show men in ways that, understands them obviously as men, but has a different idea of what masculinity is. And how that interacts with society. And so each of my novels does that in a different way. I just finished revisions on a young adult novel like 2 days ago, which does it in a whole other way. I mean, it's just I was really just absolutely kind of pushing my limits on kind of like how I can imagine and think about gender in a science fictional society, and like how I can think about masculinity and femininity, right, in a science fictional society that does not have our kind of sexism, although it might have vestiges of it. So those questions are just constantly, and I do think it's just hugely important. The Summer Prince is a novel that I've had some feedback from young men who've read it, and when I wrote it, honestly, I wasn't thinking a lot about young men reading it. I honestly thought it more about young girls, young women reading it. I mean, I honestly wrote it more kind of for like my younger self. And so it was really kind of like a moment for me to say, wait, like, oh, like boys can read. Of course they can, right? I mean, I don't know what, like I said, I mean, old, weird, dross, like, just like flotsam and jetsam, like sexism just like floating around in the back of my head. I was like, why would I expect, like, why wouldn't a boy enjoy this book? Like, I don't know why. So I was, it really humbled me, because I feel like, there was, some 15-year-old boys were like, this is like my favorite novel. Your favorite novel? And again, like I said, I mean, that was all me, I mean, like this is nothing but like love there. And it really shook me up in a sense of saying, like, yes, like you're not just writing for women, Alaya, you're not just writing for girls who have to kind of like gird their loins, try to like figure out how to live in these, powerfully sexist worlds. There's that also hugely impacts boys, and it is so important for them to have books that also depict other kinds of masculinities and other kinds of worlds, and other kinds of ways for society to organize itself, and not oppress women, which always ends up rebounding on men in other ways also, and so that to me is it's just one of those things where, I mean, honestly, my readers kind of educated me about this, and so I've been really humbled by it, and I'm kind of trying to bring that into my new work also.
That's pretty awesome, actually. Well, okay, you've kind of given me a really good segue to my next question. which is about stories. So stories are one of the most powerful ways of bringing about social change. Okay, so let's go into a question of consent. So the line between consent and coercion isn't always very clear in fantasy books. It could be epic fantasy, urban fantasy, paranormal romance is one of the big issues there. So grimdark fantasy, grimdark epic fantasy, there's violence against women is still often used as a catalyst for male characters' development, or as a shorthand for showing how brutal this world is. But do you think it's a genre, it's an issue that writers have been starting to tackle more successfully in recent years? And do you have any suggestions for SFF authors who wish to include violence against women in their books, how to do it?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a tricky issue. It's such a tricky issue because I've definitely read depictions where it did seem more gratuitous. It did seem more kind of like, oh, look at how mean this world is. Look at how edgy I am. You know, where the women just felt kind of, you know, just like pin cushions, and that to me is just deeply off-put. I mean, it's just I really can't. Like I could barely do it when I was younger, and I just can't now. And it's and I you know I despair for this because I feel like as a trope, it's so deeply shortchanges everything about the conversation of violence against women. I'm no means like an absolutist of like never depict a rape, but I feel like the criteria, the bar for that has to be so much higher. I remember now, I mean, let me just say I've been not surprised in any way by the recent allegations against Joss Whedon because, you know, I loved Buffy like many people of my age when it was on the air. I was a huge fan. There were some issues with it, you know, in hindsight that have gotten bigger. But you know, overall, the actors are great. I just loved so much of that story. But I remember because of that deep love, I was so excited when his show Dollhouse came on the air, and like I don't know when it was like 2007, 2008. And I don't even know if I want to tell people what the premise of Dollhouse was. Like, just look it up. But the point is that it was horrible. Like, I mean, it might have been good in some kind of like weird technical way, but I will say for me, like that was practically like the perfect show to demonstrate how bad storytelling is when you just use women as objects. I mean,
that was the premise of the show.
That was the premise of the show, exactly. Yeah. And over and beyond the premise of the show of these women who are used as basically sex slaves, where their memories are wiped after every time. You know, they're not always sex slaves, but they're often sex slaves that gets depicted frequently. Over and above that, one of the characters is actually raped by her handler when she's in one of her super docile states after having her memory wiped. I mean, it's just repugnant. I mean, and it's just constant. It was a constant barrage. Like the first season was just like constant rape. I mean, implied, seen, or you know, like curtains down, but it was just constant rape. And that to me really just kind of solidified exactly why you can't just say, oh, well, you know, society's so sexist, you know, so that's what I'm showing, you know, it's like I'm being feminist. Like, no, that's not what this is about. It's not just like using these images to shock people and then claiming some kind of like woke cred. It's about actually humanizing and showing the horror of that. And if you're not willing to sit with the horror of the fact that this character had been first coerced and duped into being in this society or in this kind of place where her memory was constantly wiped, and so she was like, you know, programmed to be, you know, whatever doll character that, you know, some mostly man person, you know, wanted her to be, and then her handler raped her on top of that. I mean, if you're not willing to sit with that for at least a season, with all of the effects of that and how that character like actually went from being a victim to a survivor. If that journey is not the focus of the story, then I don't want to see that. Like, I don't even want it to stop. Like that to me is really is my limit. And I feel like that is kind of, if I'm gonna have like a suggestion, like if you think that is like an incredibly important element to show, it absolutely could be. But like, why? Just to show how bad things are for a man, or because you are deeply interested in humanizing and showing the experience of that character who had to deal with that. And showing her humanity as not just a victim, but as a person who still has to live her life and still finds joy and all sorts of other things, has all sorts of other personality, elements that aren't just, being horribly victimized by somebody. If you're spending much more time trying to humanize the rapist than the victim, like, no, like that, I can't, I don't have any time for that anymore. That's the kind of stuff that I've seen it way too much, and I'm tired of it, and I'm not watching it anymore. So I mean, it's like I could imagine a good version of Dollhouse. Like, I know that sounds bizarre because I really hated that show. Like, I really, really did. But I part of the reason why I hated it was because I kept thinking to myself, I could make this a good show. Like, I could take this premise and turn it into something that would be like deeply empowering. But I would show so little of the kind of graphic rape, because that's not what it would be about for me. It would be about those women. It would be about how they how they battled their way out of that place, how they turned it in on itself, how they took one over of these guys. I wouldn't spend all my time on, the quirky scientist who's, by the way, programming women to be raped all the time. Like, I would, like, that's not my interest. And I think that's kind of what I wish people would focus on more. Like, just to think, like, what are you doing that for? Why? Who is the focus of your story? Who's the hero?
Yeah, we have a comment from the audience on that, and about The Handmaid's Tale, which is, I suppose, sort of that kind of story of how sex slaves, sort of get the power back into their hands and fight the system.
Absolutely, yeah.
Do you? Sorry, hold on. I lost my note. Okay, here it is. Sorry. Okay, so because of the nature of some of the worlds that you've created, the characters live through violence. It's a hard life, and there of course is violence against women. How do you find a balance between showing violence as an integral part of the story and not showing violence gratuitously?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, in general, this is still like the function of like what kind of story are you telling, right? So in the Summer Prince, it's not a lot of gratuitous violence because it wasn't the focus of the story, and that's not like, there was no real reason for me to show it. It was kind of enough to say, like, this happened, like, these characters were shot, this has a huge impact on their society, but not to belabor it or to have, kind of like some super gory death scenes, because like that wasn't really what I was going for aesthetically. In Troubled Saints, on the other hand, violence is very much like a focus. It's a thematic focus of the story. It's very much exploring the way structural and interpersonal violence shapes and is used by people who are at the margins of society in various ways. And so, like, that structural violence is often, it can seem so bloodless, it's just like, oh, well, this person lost their job. Oh, this person has to pay like 4 times the rent. Black people in Harlem had to pay like 5 times the rent of a white person in the Lower East Side, because they were only allowed to rent in Harlem, and the landlords charged them what they could and gave them horrible services. And, and that was just a fact of life. And that kind of structural violence, what eventually leads to what we, kind of colloquially will call violence, right? And in order to make those connections explicit in terms of like the theme, I really needed to have those kind of these moments of like overt, like blood and gore violence, like actually show up on the page in a way that kind of like shocks and kind of makes the reader like sit up and go, wait, what just happened? And the main character herself is a hit woman, so like that's part of it. I mean, a reader noted to me once, that Phyllis doesn't actually murder anybody in the present of the whole novel sequence. And she doesn't, but her violence, her past violence, her imagined violence, like her memories of violence suffuse the page. And so those moments are very much, they're very much there to kind of be like this kind of gruesome counterpoint to the structural violence that can seem otherwise kind of like very disembodied. And so to me, like that was when it was really important for me to show that in certain moments. I was very, very, very controlled moments where that violence kind of like erupts and then it recedes again. I was not out to make kind of like a super gore fest or anything, even though the main character is a gay woman. But I always try to use it in a very controlled way. Like I try to be very conscious of what I'm doing.
Okay. So many people in the anti-violence against women movement say that male violence is the main, if not the root cause of violence against women and girls and of violence in general. How do you think stories and books like yours can help move this conversation forward in a constructive way? You were saying just now that a lot of young men read your books as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly helpful to, as I say, show different ways of thinking about the world, different ideas of masculinity, different ideas of manhood. I think that's hugely important, and how to relate to women in ways that aren't violent. I mean, I think sometimes, frankly, again, like we grow up in society where violence is so normalized, especially this kind of structural violence. There's so much of just like what people kind of consider kind of background noise romantic that's not romantic, and it's violent, right? I mean, and that kind of thing I think is hugely, it's such a big thing that fiction can do to show either through contrast, which is what I try to do, like to try to just show like a totally different way of relating to somebody. And so like it kind of puts in very stark relief some of these traditional ways of courting, maybe. I don't think it's a coincidence, right, that one of the words that we will use to describe courtship is conquest. And I remember once having a conversation with like some guys about this in the bar where they were, like, oh, but like, well, how are you going to how are you going to conquest a woman? Sounds a little better in Spanish, but like, how are you going to conquest a woman if you don't, I can't do this or this thing, that I was complaining about. I was like, you can hear yourself. Like, what does conquest mean? Like, think about what conquest means. Like, you're going to like go to another land and rape and pillage it and kill everybody? I mean, like, why is this a word that we are using to describe courtship or to describe like, sexual relations between men and women?
Mm-hmm.
Like how on earth have we decided that this word is a word that is appropriate to describe how a man relates to woman? Like there's just so much violence encoded in just that one concept. And I think they kind of like, they were not expecting like that kind of heavy conversation for a bar conversation. But I mean, I really just was so fed up with hearing this over and over and over again. And so I feel that, as a writer, I'm able to say, at least, listen, here's a totally different mode of relating. Here's a totally different idea of what a romance relationship can be. But also, you can confront it a little more directly. Like I said, because Trouble of the Saints is kind of more historical fiction. Like the characters have more explicit conversations about some of these issues, and that's something else that I think can help move the needle forward. Because it's not, I mean, obviously, I feel like violence against women is deeply rooted in misogyny, and it's deeply rooted in anti-womenness or misogyny. But like, it's not necessarily only perpetrated by men, because women are often very much invested in misogynist systems and very much perpetrate them. And so it's just, I think it's hugely important to visibilize and make these issues, or make those modes of interaction like kind of like stand out a little bit more as a kind of strange and not necessarily inevitable. And try to make people think about them in a different way.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I suppose, and you're right, like you said, you have some very deep-rooted misogynistic remnants of, I mean, we all do, I do as well. But the thing is, a lot of people don't realize it, even women. And I suppose what books like yours do is plant the question, like the question you asked your friends in the bar, like, why do you use this word? But these are things that people don't think about,
Right,
because
exactly.
it's just how things are. So I guess planting that question, making people think about it, that's the key to starting the revolution.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so I have a question about geek culture. So geek culture in general, including science fiction and fantasy, we've had its share of critics saying that it's still too male dominated, despite the rising number of prominent, well-respected, well-known female authors all the time. But there is still plenty of hostile, misogynistic, sexist behavior by male geeks towards female geeks. What do you think needs to be done to make geek culture as a whole, whether it's books, comics, gaming, cons, more welcoming for women and girls?
This is an interesting question for me because when I was much younger, I kind of went to a lot of anime conventions. I loved going to Otakon in Baltimore when I was 18, 19, 20. And absolutely in confronted all these issues that people continue to complain about now because they haven't gone away. But I also kind of fell out a little bit of I continued to watch anime, but I just didn't really want to participate in those conventions that much. That might honestly be because of that exact thing. On multiple axes, like it was one of those. It was really strange, actually. Now that I'm saying this out loud, because anime was one of those worlds where I felt that there were a ton of women geeks and geeks of color, especially Black geeks who loved anime. Like we were really like a huge presence. I mean, I kept feeling this, like that in my own circle of friends, like they were just like hugely diverse and all women, and we just were total nerds, and we loved anime, and like that was kind of how we approached it. But we went to those conventions, and they were so deeply dominated by a kind of very specific white male geek culture that it did feel like strange to kind of come up against it, because that was just not all how we were relating to the subject material. And it just had nothing to do with, and because I guess like the online spaces were kind of thin, it wasn't actually like all that obvious that they weren't like what we were like, I mean, so we just went to these conventions with all this expectation, and they weren't quite what we had wanted or thought that they would be. There were a lot of really obvious kind of geek hierarchies, just the way that they would treat like the few white girls in a group versus the others. But it just all sorts of weird stuff just became really clear. And I honestly suspect, although I wasn't thinking about this consciously in any way, that I did kind of distance myself from that scene because I started to feel really weird and uncomfortable in it. And so just sort of migrated to a more personal enjoyment. And then when I went to start, joining science fiction and fantasy conventions, I noticed the same thing. There was also the kind of entrenched kind of old guard fan thing. I don't know. In terms of how to fix this, I mean, people are trying, and I deeply, deeply applaud them. Having lived in Mexico for the last 7 years, I have not, I've kind of like stepped outside of the fray in a lot of ways. Like I haven't had the money or the time to travel to these conventions, and there aren't any in Mexico. So that's probably its own thing. Like I'm not sure, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I mean, I feel that it's such an entrenched issue, and my response has been to kind of just like step back in a lot of ways, and I'm not sure that's the best response. I certainly don't think it's the response that's going to change anything, but it's the one that like made most sense with me maintaining like my emotional equilibrium and ability to continue to write in this genre. And I think that's an issue, right? It's an issue. I'm not necessarily going to say that people like me, we just have to like go in and like force ourselves to deal with this kind of low grade or sometimes very high grade hostility constantly in order to carve out our place. And I do like that there's a lot of these alternative conventions and other spaces opening up now. So like that's really exciting, but and maybe like I think with the pandemic allowing so much more online engagement, and online conventions, just exploding. And I don't think we're ever going to be able to go back to like fully just in-person cons with like no online engagement at all. And I think that might actually really open things up much more. I mean, that kind of accessibility will benefit so many people. And so I think maybe it will eventually kind of, they will kind of slowly but surely become more open spaces, but I'm not sure exactly what we can do besides what we're doing, which is sort of slowly but surely like carving out different spaces, because some of the old ones just have so clearly shown themselves to be unwelcoming.
Yeah, got it. I guess just stand your ground and don't be intimidated out of your space.
Yeah,
that's the thing as well. Yeah. Okay, so believe it or not, we've been talking for more than an hour. So here's my last question.
Okay.
Okay, so now you've been so very incredibly supportive of our Read for Pixels campaign and our anti-violence against women work as a whole. So this is a bit of a Captain Obvious question, but we like to ask all our authors this. Why do you support the cause to end violence against women? And what do you think authors can do to help with this cultural change needed to eradicate violence against women and girls?
Well, I mean, I support the cause of ending violence against women because A, it's a plague on our society, and B, it affects everybody, not just women. And it's, and women who being 50% of our society, that's kind of intense. It's probably something that would, and is, it's something that just has to be dealt with in order for any kind of like major social progress to be achieved. And I'm sorry, what was the other part of your question?
What do you think authors like yourself can do to move forward, to change society and move forward help with the cultural change needed to eradicate violence against women?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can tell our stories, try to think deeply and critically about these issues in a way that doesn't just recapitulate the kind of stories we've been given, because often they're just so steeped in misogyny and imperialism and sexism and all sorts of other isms that are just like inevitable, but also I say inevitable in the sense of our historical legacy, but not inevitable in the sense that we have to keep reproducing them, so that we are able to look at those things critically as much as we are able and tell stories that challenge or criticize or undermine or just reimagine those aspects of society.
Yeah, awesome. Okay. All right, so I think that kind of brings us to the end of the Q&A session. Thank you, everyone. Oh, somebody says, the shadows are back. So,
Yeah.
somebody walking across the light in your room.
Yes.
It gives it a really cool, moody atmosphere. Yeah, so thank you so much, Alaya, for answering all our questions. You get some really amazing answers there. And I'm sorry I didn't get to go through everyone's questions, but we just kind of ran out of time. I'm so sorry. But yeah, awesome. So I'm gonna put myself back on. Hi, everyone. Okay, so before we end, I'm gonna tell you again about all the awesome goodies that Alaya has donated to us and we've put up on our Rally Up fundraising page. So goodie number one is Alaya Dawn Johnson writes you a poem or a piece of fan fiction. So she will write one very generous donor, either a poem or a piece of flash fiction based on a word of your choice. So you will get one soft copy of the story or poem and one signed copy of the story or poem that has been scanned into a PDF file. So Alaya's short stories and poems have won so much acclaim, and she's amazing. So now you can have one especially written just for you. So goodie number two is Alaya will critique 7,000 words of your work in progress. So you'll get one written critique of a portion of your work in progress and one round of up to 5 follow-up questions in one email with Alaya after she has sent you the critique. If you're a budding fantasy author, here is your golden opportunity to get honest professional feedback of your work. And so these treats are available to donors worldwide. And we also have treats from other authors available this week, including Bridget Kemmerer, Kieran Millwood Hargrave, Anna Stevens, Sarah Rash, and even Sourcebooks has a few things they've given us. So more treats will be released every Thursday throughout this month of March. Please do give generously. Before the fundraiser ends in April, all funds go towards the Pixel Project's work to help end violence against women. I have a little slide that I can share with everyone, if I can manage to open it. There we go. So here we have some links. I hope you can see it. There it is. Okay, so donate for goodies at our Rally Up page. That's the link, bit.ly R4P Rally Up IWD 2021. Make sure you put 2021 because we have stuff from previous years as well. And our moderators are going to put it in the chat box as well, so you can easily click the link. If you want to find out more about Read for Pixels, about all the other amazing authors we have coming up, so remember Alaya is the first of many, go to our Read for Pixels schedule the link will be up on the chat box as well, and you can just check that out. And if you just want to find out about violence against women in general, what you can do to help stop it, go and visit the Pixel Project's website at thepixelproject.net. Okay, so okay, I think that's it. One last thing though, Alaya, do you have any announcements that you want to make for everyone?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I am one of the contributors of a new Wonder Woman serial called Heartless, which is going to be kind of coming out with its new episodes starting this month on Serial Box. And yeah, so it's actually totally dealing with all sorts of issues that we touched on today. So you might check that out.
Okay, awesome. Cool. Oh, and I think we have a link for that as well. So one of our producers is going to put that in the link. So all you guys can, in the chat box, so all you guys can check that out. Yeah, and that's it. So thank you so much, Alaya, for this amazing time. Thank you for giving us all your great insights. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Anusha. It was a wonderful interview. Loved being able to dig into these thorny issues.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so good night, everybody, or good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. So goodbye.
Bye.